Hello and welcome to this World Data Forum session hosted by the Inclusive Data Charter on making the invisible visible through new approaches to inclusive data. As you may know, the Inclusive Data Charter brings together governments, multilaterals, and civil society organizations to improve and strengthen data, disaggregation, and inclusivity in progress towards the leaving no one behind agenda. Too often, the poorest, most vulnerable people are invisible in data. This exacerbates their marginalization even further. And we need not look further than the COVID-19 pandemic, which has highlighted this to a devastating effect. Marginalized groups' needs are underrepresented in the data used to make critical decisions. We are now producing more data than ever before. If brought together in new ways to explore innovative and different ways to do this, the existing data could make marginalized people's multifaceted lives and needs more visible. The opportunity is clear to all of us, but we still need to build consensus on key questions. For example, how can we identify the intersecting barriers limiting people's progress? How do we ensure the right balance between the need for granular data on marginalized groups and ensuring their privacy and anonymity? How can we forge more open collaboration across different types of actors to increase the availability and the use of data? We are pleased today to be joined in the session by representatives from different organizations who will talk about the importance of representation. Using participatory approaches in collecting data, they're going to give us examples how this can be done, as well as how they are adapting to using new and innovative approaches to generate more inclusive data. We're joined in this session by Liz McKeon, who's the Director, Public Policy Analysis, Lydia Stazen, who's an Executive Director, and Maria Njeri, who's a citizen reporter, and Aina Setre, who's a statistics project expert. I'm going to ask them some questions, and of course, they will make presentations. And after that, we'll have an opportunity for an interactive discussion where we can discuss further specific issues that emerge during this particular session. So I'm going to turn to you, Liz McKeon, to start us off. Please make a presentation and then we'll pick it up from there. Thank you.
Many thanks. Really delighted to be speaking at today's event. To just introduce myself briefly, I'm Liz McKeon, Director of Public Policy at the Office of National Statistics. That's the UK's National Statistics. I think it's fair to say that at ONS, we've long been committed to using new approaches to inclusive data. To give a few examples over recent years, we've used new data sources and new methods and approaches to shine a light on some of the most vulnerable in society, exploring topics including deaths of homeless people, student suicides, child bereavement, and domestic violence. But since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we've seen the imperative for inclusive data grow even further, as we heard in those introductory remarks. The pandemic's had really profound impacts on our health and on the functioning of our society and economy. And our job here in ONS has been to produce a comprehensive picture of what is happening across the UK and provide the public and policymakers with the information they need to manage the pandemic and its wider social and economic effects. A really important aspect of this has been to understand how different groups in society are differentially affected by COVID-19. This has required us to think in creative ways to make best possible use of the data available and to stand up new surveys and make use of new data sources to generate the best possible insights. I want to use the majority of my opening remarks to focus on the work we've been progressing to understand how COVID-19 mortality varies by ethnicity. In the UK, ethnicity is not recorded on the death certificate, and so it was not immediately possible to assess this. We had to think about other ways to undertake the analysis. What we ultimately did was to link deaths involving COVID-19 to the 2011 census. This allowed us to ascertain the self-reported ethnicity of the deceased, and importantly, to capture other demographic factors at the same time. In June, we published our findings that explored deaths by ethnic group in the period between March and May. Our analysis of deaths over that period showed that Black males were at 3.3 times greater risk of death involving COVID-19 than white males of the same age, while Black females were 2.4 times at greater risk than their white counterparts of the same age. We knew there were a whole range of factors working together here, so what we subsequently did was adjust for some of the shared characteristics that may play a role. These included geographical, demographic, and socioeconomic factors, and differences in occupational exposure. In adjusting for some of the characteristics, we were able to explain some of the increased risk. There was still a proportion that was unexplained. In fact, our research showed there remained twice the risk for Black males and around 1.5 times for Black females. Significant differences also remain for Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Indian men. This showed that for some ethnicities, there was a disproportionate risk of death involving COVID-19. What we are doing now is undertaking further research to help understand this difference, including analysis of underlying health conditions. Other studies outside of the Office of National Statistics have focused more on understanding these comorbidities, but we are yet to fully understand the interactions between the comorbidities and other socioeconomic factors. This is the current focus. The next steps in our analysis are to link data to other health records, which will allow us to look at those comorbidities. And we also intend to bring the analysis up to date for deaths that have occurred after May. This will provide more insight into the impact of underlying conditions and the extent to which these explain the differences that we have observed in mortality among different ethnic groups. Probably worth saying that the data set that we are creating for this purpose will also help shed light on public health more generally. We're planning further work on analysing health inequality by demographic, social, and economic characteristics. Using this data asset, including differences in mental health and life expectancy at a more granular level than it's been possible before. And I think it's probably important to draw out some of the wider work we do using the data set that we've created to assess that particular challenge, because I think it's illustrative of how during the pandemic, we've worked at real pace to make our data more inclusive, to fill evidence gaps that have persisted for some time. And I think now there's a real chance that we can build on the work we've done over the period of the pandemic to accelerate the pace on making sure that our statistics leave no one behind. And I'm looking forward to the discussions that follow where I have a chance to discuss some of these issues in more detail.
Thank you so much, Liz. We definitely look forward to a conversation after all the presentation. Lydia, over to you. What are your thoughts on this?
Hi, everyone. So pleased to be participating in today's session. I'm Lydia Stays, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Global Homelessness. And one of the questions that we get constantly asked at IGH is, how many people in the world are homeless? And the truth is we don't have a very good answer for that. The last global estimate that was done about 20 years ago by UN Habitat, and really was just an estimate, just a guess of how many people around the world were homeless. And that number is between 100 and 150 million. So we know it's a huge problem, but we don't have better data to tell us, is that number increasing or decreasing over time? And IGH has made it one of our aims to answer that question. Teacher, could you bring up the first slide? So the first thing that we really did was to sit down with a group of researchers and work to define what homelessness looks like around the world. It looks very different in different places, and we recognize that. And so we created this framework of 3 different categories, which you should be able to see now, and subcategories that talks about what it might look like around the world for people who are living completely without accommodation, for people who are living in temporary or crisis accommodation, and for people who are living in severely inadequate and insecure accommodation. These are all forms and manifestations of homelessness. So really the first step in collecting good data on homelessness is the definition. What is it that we're trying to measure? And then we piloted these definitions of homelessness in the communities where IGH works. Teacher, could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And so you can see that IGH, we work specifically in 13 communities around the world where we piloted these definitions. We said to our local leadership teams there, what does homelessness look like in your community? And showed them the rubric, and they were able to tell us. For example, our colleagues in Rijeka, Croatia don't have street homelessness exactly the way that our colleagues in Chicago, Illinois, USA do. In Chicago, most of the people who are sleeping rough are literally living on the streets underneath overpasses where cars and trucks go, sometimes with tents. However, in Rijeka, their homelessness looks very different. The people who are homeless there are living in sort of abandoned, decrepit buildings. So we found the tool to be really helpful in creating that common language. So we understand when we're moving between communities, what form of homelessness we're talking about. And then we've worked with those communities to count how many people in their city are experiencing that form of homelessness. Chicago, for example, had many years of great data around homelessness. That in Rijeka, Croatia, we helped our colleagues there do the first ever count of people who were experiencing homelessness. And, you know, for us, this is important for a lot of reasons. For one, it's important to know over time, is homelessness increasing or decreasing in various communities? What's causing those increases and decreases so that we can get more targeted with the solutions that we're helping to implement. I'm really pleased to say that in February of 2020, the Commission on Social Development of the United Nations put out the first resolution on homelessness at the UN in more than 30 years. And in that resolution, they use language that's very similar to IGH's framework of people who are without accommodation, in temporary accommodation, or in inadequate accommodation. And they call for member states to measure, to collect disaggregated data towards these different definitions of homelessness. And so we're extremely pleased to see the United Nations speaking about this issue, and we hope to work with more communities and more member states in the coming years to help, you know, define what homelessness means to them, measure what it means to them, and really build this global data set around homelessness. We believe that none of the SDGs will be able to be successfully accomplished over the next 10 years if homelessness is not also included in the strategies and in the data. We think about SDG 1 and poverty in all its forms, but none of the indicators on SDG 1 talk about homelessness, which we believe to be the most visible manifestation of poverty. And so you can see how we're beginning to, you know, sort of share this framework around the world, get communities on board in helping to name what homelessness looks like there, to measure, and to begin to spread that across the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for those highlights on homelessness. I'm coming to you, Maria Njeri, as a citizen reporter, to give us some insights from Leonard Chisha. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thrilled to be here. I'm learning so much already. My name is Maria Njeri. I'm a youth citizen reporter and a youth advocate for Leonard Chisha. And I'm here to speak about collecting data for youth with disabilities in Kenya through evidence-based data collection. I was involved in a program called the 2030 and Counting which brought together young women and men with disabilities from Kenya, the Philippines, and Zambia to report and advocate for their rights through the framework of the SDGs. The SDGs agenda core commitment is to leave no one behind. And we emphasize that the SDGs cannot be achieved unless they are meant for everyone. However, young women and men with disabilities are often left behind and fall through the cracks. The initiative was a citizen-generated data collection bringing together youth with disabilities led by their own youth with disabilities and alongside DPOs. Our approach with the 2030 Encounter embed the use of evidence-based data collection and harnessing the use of technology. I'll give a funny story where I would occasionally think that youth with disabilities had very little to bring to the table. Maybe none of them. And through the initiative, we had 20 young people with disabilities in a meeting, and we gave them a platform and to open up and speak out. And we realized they know what they want, they know what works and what doesn't, they know the gaps in the system, and most importantly, they know the solutions to the challenges they face. Youth with disabilities are indeed experts of their experiences. Their stories are the missing voices in development. 2030 Encounter was one of the programs that give traditionally unheard voices a platform to speak up and get involved in citizen-led data. The intent of the evidence-based data collection is in acknowledging that everyone has a story to tell. And those stories are the data we need. Evidence-based data collection also trains the members of the community as citizen reporters, and this helps to bring them to people's everyday experiences. Accessibility was also key in the 2030 Encounter program. Evidence-based data is and should be accessible to all. Both the producers and the users of data align the process to be real-time on their own perspectives. We harness the use of technology in the data collection. The trick part of our project was we allowed the youth to use their mobile phones to send us their stories, wherever they were, with whatever phone they had, from a basic mobile phone to the most advanced smartphone. But we noticed 80% of the youth with disabilities had access to them and access to text messaging and video and audio. This also allowed our data to be inclusive and allowed those who are furthest from modernization and information and infrastructure to also be part of the data. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria Njeri, for those insights on evidence-based data collection. Now, my last speaker is Aina, who's going to also give us some highlights, and then we'll go into a bit of a discussion soon after. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm Aina Satra, and I'm working in UNHCR, or the UN Refugee Agency, as a senior statistics and data analyst. But I'm also having the pleasure of being the coordinator of the expert group on refugee and IDP statistics, or internally displaced person statistics. So I have chosen to use this opportunity to spread the word about the work of that group. I'm not going to focus too much on what UNHCR does in the area of COVID, but just to mention that there is a lot done by the organization to improve data on those issues at the moment. And as you know, the forcibly displaced, the category including both refugees and IDPs, are one of the most vulnerable in the COVID context. But before going into the group work, I just wanted to give you a glimpse of the latest statistics on forcibly displaced. The data dates back to end of 2019 and the Global Trends report from UNHCR. And as you can see, it's an extremely high number of forcibly displaced, 79.5 million. And that includes both 26 million refugees, 45.7 internally displaced persons, 4.2 asylum seekers, and 3.6 million Venezuelans displaced abroad. And this, just to highlight that this does not include refugees or climate refugees or IDPs displaced due to climate catastrophes. This also includes, or an estimate of 40% of these 79.5 million are children below 18 years of age. So next slide, please. This is the group that I want to talk about. And as I mentioned, IGRIS has been a key, UNHCR has been a key player since the very beginning. The group was established back in 2015. One reason, as already mentioned, this increasing number of forcibly displaced persons worldwide, also an identified need for better evidence-based policy and practices. There was seen a consistent challenge in producing statistics on forcibly displaced, not only at international level, but also at regional and national level. In many other areas, there were already existing standards and recommendation on how to produce statistics. In this particular area, nothing existed before this group. Also need to build capacity among national partners, national statistical offices, especially in the South, in the area of statistics on forcibly displaced. And also, of course, and maybe the starting point and the most important, the belief that if you have this included into national statistical systems, production of statistics on these groups, it will increase the probability of having it included into national programs and planning. So it's a map here showing where we have our members. And of course, these are mainly from the National Statistical System, so national statistical offices. And of course, also living with the COVID reality every day. So we get that reality through our groups. Next slide, please. So just quickly on what the recommendations include. Next slide, please. We have recommendations on refugees, which include, for the first time, a statistical framework, where we also have defined terminology and classifications. We have examples of data tabulations, or recommendations rather, around how to tabulate and also how to develop indicators. We discuss data sources and methods, especially indicators around socioeconomic situations are included, and also a chapter on coordination. Next slide, please. The recommendations on IDPs are structured along the same structure, has also a framework, also discusses different data sources, and talks about the coordination. Next slide, please. Next slide, yeah. And when from here, we are now in 2020, and we actually have a mandate until 2024 to deliver on the recommendations. So now we have the recommendations. Now we really have to take this into implementation at country level. We're fortunate enough to have funding for this implementation plan. And we have started a rollout. We've developed 3 different subgroups, one around the whole promotion and dissemination, one around capacity building, and one around knowledge sharing and development of a compiler's manual. So this work is now, was kicked off last week with a global conference, and we have a lot of interest in joining our groups. In addition, we have established 3 subgroups around COVID response, but also on the SDGs, as well as starting to think about similar recommendations on statelessness statistics. So just to conclude and say that the group is expanding, and if there is anyone interested in joining, it's very inclusive, and you're welcome to reach out. And here are some more information and some contact details. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aina. So we will go into a bit of a discussion right now. And perhaps I'll start with a question that lingers on when you talk about data, statistics, etc., even on marginalized groups. You know, how do we ensure that we have the right balance between the need for granular data on those marginalized groups, but at the same time, you know, we protect their privacy and anonymity? I don't know if these are things you integrate in your day-to-day, you know, data collection, etc. And maybe we'll start with you, Njeri, if you could give us some highlights on that. Jerry, can you hear me? Yeah, still muted. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. We can enter balance for this program. The 2030 enabled the youth with disabilities to tell their own stories in their own words. All the youth with disabilities are trained on the rights, on the ethics, on the risk, such as what is more fact and more what is more fictional. And these training cards acted as reminders for the community of what they were allowed to share. For people with disabilities, it's a question of protecting their dignity. And also ensuring that the story, the way we did it is options of telling their stories either anonymously or in some cases putting their names on the stories. This could also be a better vision that we them from the beginning of the project. Thank you.
All right, thank you. You are cutting out quite a little bit, but we did get to your main points around training and, of course, making them aware about their rights and protecting their dignity. So thank you very much for that. Liz, I'm coming to you in terms of how, on this subject, especially on privacy, how do you go about it?
No, thanks very much. I just wanted to pick up on something that Maria said about the importance of people being able to tell the stories in their own words, and that's such a powerful point, I think, and one that we are increasingly thinking about how we bring qualitative data together with quantitative data and the impact that can have, particularly with more marginalized groups. A couple of examples in that space. We wanted to do more on children's experiences of loneliness, and quite often actually how children experience loneliness has just been disregarded, and we've thought of loneliness as something that only affects older people. And qualitative research there and allowing children to tell their own stories about loneliness was really, really powerful. So that just really resonated with me, and we're looking to do that more in the period ahead. But to take the broader question on privacy and on making sure that we make that balance between the granularity of the responses we want and making those meaningful, so that we can actually use sort of the results to give that data and information and insights to policymakers, so they can actually take action and make a difference for these marginalized communities. There's a whole range of things I think you want to put in place to make sure that you do maintain the privacy of respondents. I mean, we have all sorts of procedures and protocols around disclosure controls, around privacy, around anonymity, about how data is used, how it's protected and how it's shared. I think more broadly, making sure that actually that our work has a sound ethical foundation to begin with is really important. And we have the National Statisticians Ethical Advisory Panel, where we can take new data collections to and get advice about whether they are meeting the sort of ethical standards required. And I think then bringing all that together, there's something around how we give assurances to people who are going to take part in our studies, who are going to respond to us, about how that data is actually going to be used to make things better. And being clear about the value of that data up front can be really important. At the moment, one of our studies is an infection survey, and that actually is involving taking swabs and blood from people, and that's a high level of trust needed. And one of the reasons that we are getting high participation in that study is that people can really see the value of it and how the results will really matter for tackling the pandemic. So being clear about that public good, I think, is another important element. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for those insights. Lydia, I'll be coming to you shortly, but Aina, in your presentation, I saw you are working with many different actors in this. And the question to you is, how do we forge more open collaboration across different types of actors to ensure that available data, especially on marginalized people, is actually used to inform decision making, be it data that comes from citizens or civil society, and this data is actually used by governments.
Yeah, used by governments, but also used by people that we collect the data from themselves, but and academia, and I think that's one of the purposes of this work as well, to be able to make the data more available to not only the data collectors, but also a wider group of audience. And in UNHCR at the moment, we have a push towards getting this data out, and we've developed this microdata library, which is making data sets available to the public through a request process, of course, but still it's a huge improvement and progress in that area compared to where we were just some time back. But I think it's also it's a lot about what Liz talked about, trust, that we can also make sure that data is managed and handled in such a way that all the protection needs are taken into consideration. And I think the IGRIS is around production of official statistics, and we have standards, and we have all these guidelines in place, but I think we still need to really make sure that this is followed, and also constantly communicate around the trust and the interest from all parties to make sure that the standards are in place and followed.
Great, thank you so much. Lydia, over to you. Obviously, the issue of trust has been discussed, and the question is, how do we ensure that the marginalized groups are actually involved in the collection of the data, and hopefully then that helps us to build trust?
I think the key is to set the table at the right time. I think oftentimes at least in the issue of homelessness, we think about how do we involve people of lived experience, but we think about it too late. And really, we need to be bringing in people who have experienced homelessness at every single step of the process. So set the right table early. And make sure that people who have that experience of homelessness are able to participate at every step of the way, whether that's consulting on project design, whether that's helping to identify which data points should be collected, how that data is collected, how that data is used, and so that their voice and their experience is embedded into every single step of the process. The other thing that we talk a lot about at the Institute of Global Homelessness is that behind every single number is a human being and a story. And we work a lot with researchers who love the complex, multifaceted issue of homelessness and could just study it endlessly. But we at IGH know and believe, like, we're studying this issue, we're collecting this data in order to bring an end to that problem. And so always keeping that as kind of our North Star, that this data reflects an experience that should not exist in our world.
Great. And Jerry, back to you. Just quickly, how have you engaged with governments, and have they been open, to the citizen-generated data that you've been providing?
Davis, I can hear you. Yeah, I'm mute. I think you're mute, David.
Oh, sorry. This mute and mute problem cuts across moderators and presenters. The question was, you know, as the citizen-generated data that you've collected, have you had an opportunity to engage with government? And how was the reception from the government counterparts from the evidence that you had collected?
Well, yes, we had a chance to engage with the different stakeholders and also our district chance to present the findings and the report to various forums. And our first reaction, especially from the government states, of the idea of youth with disability, of people with disability collecting data about their own challenges and about the barriers they face. So the first reaction was one of awe, but it was a very positive engagement, because then we had a chance to break down the challenges we have in the society, and also we gave them an idea of you can involve people with disabilities to manage, because one of the challenges that we face is this no direct collaboration between people with disability. We always have them as data users, but we never consider them to be part of the process and as data producers. So it was a very engaging discussion, and we look forward to the future brilliance of the program.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And back to you, Liz. Do you get an opportunity to work with other stakeholders beyond government agencies and departments? And how does that happen? Is there direct collaboration, or is more of just information sharing in this area?
No, thanks for the question. I think a really important one. Partnership working has become ever more important to us, and I think if we are going to have data that can tell a story about everyone in society, we can't rely on official sources of data alone. And so partnerships with civil society are really important to get a whole picture of what's going on. And in some of our recent statistical bulletins that I mentioned a bit earlier, for example, on domestic violence, we've drawn data from civil society sources, and that's allowed us to have a much richer picture of the issue in its totality than we would have had otherwise. But I think that partnership is not just at the data collection stage. It's also about how we are disseminating our data and how those insights are reaching practitioners. And often civil society will have much more direct and meaningful contact with practitioners than government will do, or a or a statistical institute will do. And therefore, we can really see that actually those partnerships with civil society not only allow us to have a better range and depth of data to begin with, it then also allows us to propagate our insights to a much wider audience, and hopefully for those insights to have the impact that we've always intended. So we're always keen to partner with civil society for that reason. I think we're all sort of adjusting to the challenge of face-to-face communication being much harder at the moment. In the past, we've run a number of public policy forums where we've brought together civil society, academia, analysts from across government to look at issues. For example, having one on inequalities, but also on housing and on migration and on other public policy issues. And they've been really great to have a sort of exchange of views from all those different audiences, a sharing of data, sharing of insights. We're now in the process of thinking what that looks like on a more online world, and interested in how others are adapting to make sure that actually when face-to-face communication, which can often be more meaningful and quite good at breaking down barriers, is not possible, how can we still make sure that we're engaging with the widest possible range of stakeholders?
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much, Liz, for those insights. Lydia, I don't know if there's, I saw in your presentation also the use of technology and, in displaying some of the information, when it comes to data and its presentation. Have you applied this, or do you see value in different, using innovative multiple sources of data in presenting or using this data?
Definitely. I think the visualization of data is so powerful because it allows people who maybe don't have a data analysis background to quickly understand what's happening and then begin to ask the right questions behind it. I'll never forget sitting at a stakeholder group when we were able to, show in a visual, the number of people who were experiencing homelessness, the length of time they were experiencing homelessness in a particular community, and that group at the table, which was a mix of government agencies, service providers, civil society leaders, begin, after just a few moments of reflecting on that visualization, start to ask why this was the case. Why were people, staying so long in homelessness before being moved on to accommodation, and just the power in that room. And it was a real example of data-informed decision-making. And once you have the higher level visualization, you can ask the right questions. You can go back and look at the data and see why is this happening, and begin to get more and more targeted with the solutions. So to put data into action, I think the visualization of that is the real key.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those insights on data visualization and presentation. I would like to sincerely thank all of you for finding time to join us for this particular session. We hope that many others out there will benefit from it, and we encourage all those who will be watching this particular session and other participants to share their questions with our team at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And of course, would like to reiterate the need for continued dialogue and action and sharing of experiences and knowledge, etc., which then helps us to broaden the scope of what it is that we are doing. I think we must all work to make sure that the invisible become more visible in data, and that this data actually drives more inclusive policies and decisions so that no one is left behind. Just a reminder that the Inclusive Data Charter, who put together this particular session, is an open and growing network working towards this particular goal and others. And we're inviting all of you and many others to join us in this particular movement to accelerate action for more inclusive data. So thank you so much. We'd truly appreciate you joining us, and we look forward to future engagements with all of you.